I think Modi has not fundamentally moved India toward a higher growth model.
Hi, I'm Shoma Chaudhury. Thanks for watching Enquiry. India and America are going through very intriguing phases as democracies where none of the old rule books work. So, how are we to interpret ourselves? What are the truths we need to confront? And what are the hardest lessons from 2020 to examine this changing phenomenon of who we are as nations and what Trump, Biden, and Modi are saying about us as societies and economies? I'm delighted to have with me a very special guest on Enquiry today, global analyst, CNN host, and one of America's most respected voices, Fareed Zakaria. Fareed has written a new book called 10 Lessons of a Post-Pandemic World, and we'll be drawing on that and much more. Thanks for joining me, Fareed.
It's my pleasure. So nice to be here.
So Fareed, let me start with, on a slightly personal note, actually. You know, you were betting, even though in 2016 you were wrong, you said that you would rather believe in the America that you came to and the idea of America that you have, and you were sure that Biden would win this time. Now that he's won, but Trump has still got 43.7% of the vote, what do you feel about America now? You know, you said when you came, it embraced you, it was an open society. What do you feel about America now?
There's no question that the United States has changed. Over the 35 years that I've been here, what has been remarkable to me is how open, how inviting it was through all the turmoils, even after 9/11, while there was an initial emotional reaction. By and large, the public at large did not have this sense of suspicion about foreigners, let alone a kind of hatred or anything like that. Trump has been able to kind of energize and weaponize this issue in a way that nobody had been able to do before. When I look at my Twitter feed or emails that I would get, calls that I would get, the real shift takes place when Trump starts campaigning and he starts very openly using racially charged language and things like that. So I think there is a side of America that has been kind of awakened, and it's a very good example of how leadership matters. You know, it's not just that these feelings exist in the population. I would make an analogy actually to India.
Yeah.
You know, people have good sides and bad sides. We all have our darker fears and our sunnier hopes. And the task of leadership, in a way, is to appeal to the better angels of our nature rather than to the darker demons of our nature. But all that said, let's remember Biden's win is pretty decisive. He won the electoral college by as much as Trump did in 2016. He has won the popular vote by 6 million, where Hillary won by 3 million. He has won in percentage terms by a greater number than any challenger to an incumbent president since Franklin Roosevelt in 1932.
But also, Fareed, that it would be short-sighted to not look at the fact that despite these, very tumultuous 4 years, Trump has also gone up by 10 million votes, and he has exceeded his percentages. He's he's even increased the Hispanic and the Black vote that's come to him. So there's definitely signs to be read there. And beyond our settled positions, Fareed, what is the hardest lesson you've taken from here? Of course, the visible factor is that he's given voice to a certain aspect of America, but do you think it's a very essential part of America which just didn't have voice earlier? You yourself said you grew up in New England towns. Most of the institutions were in a sense captured by the liberal voice. Now social media has actually thrown up a democratic voice. So do you think that one has to live with this understanding that this is a very large part of America?
Yeah, it's a fair point. As I said, there's no question that these feelings lay beneath the surface for a lot of people, that Trump, in a sense, gave permission to people to say some of these things. My Black friends point out to me that these feelings have not been so underneath the surface for them, for example. What is new and permanent is this widening class divide that is layered on top of a kind of racial divide. And it's an odd racial divide because what is happening is the white working class feels that it is sort of the loser in the last 30 years, which have been shaped by two great forces, globalization and the technological revolution, the information revolution. And for particular reasons, they feel left behind. In globalization, they feel as though foreign trade has meant that their jobs have become less valuable. Many of those jobs have gone. The technological revolution means that technology has replaced a lot of what they did, and again made what they do less valuable. Now, what Trump has actually done in the last in this 2020 election is brought in some of the non-white working class into that mix. So what you saw was a rise of Hispanic vote for him, and even some of the black vote for him. And I actually think that's fundamentally healthy. I don't think it's a good thing for the two-party system in America to be divided on purely racial lines. I think it's a good thing that people who feel that their, if you will, class interests are closer to the Republican Party should adopt that. But the biggest divide now is described by a writer at The Atlantic very well. It's density plus diplomas. If you live in a densely populated area and you have a diploma of some kind, you likely voted for Joe Biden. If you lived in a sparsely populated area and do not have a diploma of some kind, you voted for Donald Trump. That has become the great divide in America. It's unfortunately, it's almost a cultural and class divide, which means it's very hard to bridge. If there were a divide over policy, well, at least you can compromise on policy. But if it's these deeper core identities, it's very hard to compromise.
But Fareed, I still feel that we're all using very comfortable, parameters within which to understand a very difficult phenomenon that's going on. Because, when you're talking about Trump, I think the thing that we're also not looking at is that he claimed he'd created the largest poverty reduction program in American history. And apparently it was true, it was not getting the kind of focus that it needed, because he pulled in 1 year 4.2 million people out of poverty, which was last done by Lyndon Johnson in 1966, And he said that he had brought in the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years. And that turned out to be true too. At February pre-pandemic, America was at 3.5% unemployment. And so even while one is hating on him, there are certain things he's doing where people are feeling uplifted, and if he improved unemployment figures, that means Blacks and Hispanics would have improved as well. And now just before you came online, there was a very interesting thing that's been thrown up, which is that California has rejected the affirmative action that was being proposed, and that's highly Hispanic, predominantly like whites are just 37% in that state. Florida, on the other hand, has voted for $15 minimum wage, which will benefit 53% of Hispanics and Black, and whites will not benefit. And yet a Republican state has voted for that. These are very complex signs, which one does not seem to be looking at enough. Would you agree? And how do you read that?
Sure. So let's start. It's a large question. Let's start with Trump's economic record. There are 2 points to be made, both of which I may have made over the years, even though it's been controversial. First, Trump's economy. Let's remember, the U.S. is a $20 trillion economy. The president doesn't have that much to do with it. Was a continuation of the Obama recovery. The fundamental fact is this: in the last 4 years of the Obama administration, unemployment went down more than in the 4 years of the Trump administration. But because Trump was, in a sense, getting it at a good point, the numbers, depending on how you slice it, you can make one point or the other. What I would say is, ever since the 08-09 financial crisis, the U.S. had a slow, steady recovery that Trump presided over the last 4 years of that. He didn't screw it up in any way, and I don't mean to suggest that. Secondly, his emphasis on deregulation and some of the tax cuts, the corporate tax cut, were good for business and were good for reducing unemployment. And I think liberals need to understand better that you need to make capitalism work in order to then have the revenues. So to do all the wonderful spending that liberals want to do, which I generally support. Then I write about this in the book on how, the Northern Europeans, Denmark, Sweden, places like that, are actually economically less regulated than the United States. Your larger question, look, the United States is a middle of the road country. The points you were making about those referendum in California and places like that is absolutely true. It is not a place that wants radicalism either in economic or in social policy. The minimum wage is essentially a left-wing idea that has become now, as you point out, more and more popular, even in right-wing states. The idea of having more and more identity politics protections is something even many Hispanics don't like. So it doesn't surprise me that what you're seeing is when somebody lurches too far in one direction, you see a course correction. But, again, if you want to look at the deepest reality of American politics right now, is that you have majorities in favor of many policies that are essentially center-left that cannot get enacted because the Republican Party has found a way to stay in power without winning a majority of the vote. Remember, this is now the 8th presidential election in which the Democrat has won a majority of the popular vote. There is only one election in that 8 elections that the Republican won the majority, and that was after 9/11, George W. Bush. This is an unprecedented run in American history for a party to, over a span of 8 presidential elections, win 7 times the popular vote. The senators who represent the Republicans in the Senate get 20 million fewer votes than the senators who represent the Democrats. So, that is one of the structural complexities. So when you say, well, how does America feel? Well, America as a country feels, in one way, but then the political system, because of the way it's designed, empowers these small rural states. And therefore, you don't see, for example, more gun control legislation, even though 65% of the country wants most of these gun laws passed.
Right. So I'm going to cycle back to, a little bit more of the personal, Fareed.
Sure.
Just for a moment, take off your newsman's hat and just describe what Trump has meant for you. When you look back on these 4 years, what do you see?
So for me, it's different.
Give vent to your emotions,
Yeah, it's an odd feeling because at one level, I'm obviously insulated. I'm well off. I'm well known. I have all kinds of trappings that protect me. Look, I've met Trump. He's invited me to the White House for lunch. He's a very social, charming person. He can be very funny. So, I've seen that side to him. I know his daughter and Ivanka and Jared quite well. So, at one level, I have the ability to navigate that world. On the other hand, because I'm well known and because I have a identifiably foreign name and I have brown skin and things like that, I can also be a target. So I have gotten emails and phone calls. My little girls, I should say that my little girls, but when Trump was running in 2015, my daughters were still little. And we got phone calls in the house from people saying, tell your father to go back to where he came from and things like that. So, I experienced some of what happens when you unleash these kind of forces. And so I did personally see how that kind of thing can work. But I have to say, for me personally, honestly, America has been basically nothing but open, inviting, friendly. And as I say, in that column you were referring to, my America has been New Haven, Connecticut, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and New York. If I had lived in Alabama and Mississippi, maybe I'd feel differently. But the truth is also, what I'm struck by is before the pandemic, I used to do a lot of public speaking. There's an interesting thing about how people's venality and venom shows, which is you see it the most on Twitter because people can be anonymous there. You see it not at all in person. I have been active as a public intellectual for 25 years in the United States. I can recall one instance where somebody personally came up to me and said nasty things.
But, Fareed, there I would just push back a little bit. You yourself actually said that your privilege protects you, but it was fascinating how Van Rossen broke down on TV. And, there was a kind of really pent-up tension that came out when he said it's easier to be a parent now, to just insist that it's important to be a decent, honest man, and you're not worried about, whether because you're black, you're going to get that kind of pushback. So, I was really asking, you said, okay, you've seen the charming version of Trump, but how does a man as chaotic as that, someone who's lied, his family has also used external emails, they blamed Hillary for it, they themselves have done it, he's, tax, locker room banter, to just, there's nothing that he really hasn't done, which you would expect a president not to do. And yet he got past everything, so has American exceptionalism really failed, that the structures didn't hold, institutions didn't hold? Do you today very honestly feel that American exceptionalism is a false claim?
It's a good question. I mean, I think preeminently the tragedy of Trump for me is the one you're referring to. It's his character, not his policies. Policies, some were good, some were bad. Many I disagreed with, but I could see there are honorable reasons to believe in them. Even with the immigration issues, I mean, I can understand people may have a different view. The fundamental problem was he's a third-rate human being. He is a man of very low moral character. I think the difference I would say is, between Van and me, I have not looked to American presidents to invariably to gain moral instruction. I grew up in politics. My dad was a politician. I've seen a lot of bad characters in politics over the years. I feel that people of high character are rare. Sometimes they're in politics. I think Obama was a very decent human being, whether you thought he was a good president or not. And to me, that is the central mystery of Trump. Why people can't see through what is to me so clearly a scam. How could 72 million Americans not see this deficiency in character, or see it and say, despite that, we are going to vote for this person? And that does reflect, there's a brokenness to the political culture. Something has happened where people feel this sense of despair and fear. And I think it's those kind of feelings of fear and despair that allow you to take the view, he may be whatever he is, but at least he's fighting for me. Now, it's a con job because he's not actually fighting for them. He's fighting for himself. On the larger issue of American exceptionalism, look, I still think this is the only example in history of a truly multicultural, multiracial democracy that is trying to make it work and that has succeeded for 250 odd years. And that is something very special. And I think it continues to be. At the end of the day, look at the institutions. What you have with Trump is a genuine demagogue who is a genuinely authoritarian tendencies, who clearly would like to nullify the results of the election and stay in power. He's not going to be able to. The system is strong enough, the institutions are strong enough that no matter what he does, at the end of the day, he will have to leave.
It's true. I guess some of the gloss is gone, because one has seen the rotting sort of structures, whether it's on health or it's inequity or, all of that. But before we come to Biden and what it means for India and all of that, I wanted to focus just for a moment on Obama, Fareed. Like you mentioned, he's a really decent man, educated. One would imagine everyone would warm to him. But what was the gap in those 8 years that at the end of his presidency, there's this vacuum and there's this pent-up emotion that throws up a Trump? What do you think was the feelings, and what is that disjunction between liberals and people on the ground? What is the criticism liberals need to face themselves? And the second is something that you have, of course, thought and written about, which is the biggest dilemma of democracy is when democracy itself throws up conservative, bigoted, impulses in society. What do you do when that is what democracy has thrown up? Would you address both those questions?
So with regard to Obama, I think one would have to say this is an area where, I'm reluctant to say this because I don't like to kind of racialize politics because it's complex. There are many things going on. But clearly something that happened with the election of Obama was something very few people saw, which was that it created a quiet but growing backlash among a large number of Americans when they confronted face to face a black man and a black woman and 2 black children in the White House. Why is that such a big deal? Look, one of the things I remember reading a book when I was in undergraduate, great American historian, wrote a book asking why a place like Virginia, which had been the birthplace of American freedom, 4 of the first 5 presidents came from Virginia, and yet it had the largest slaveholding population. How did it reconcile these two things? And one of the things he points out, this man, Edmund Morgan, a great book called American Slavery, American Freedom, he points out that America made a deal with its working class whites, which said, we know your life looks tough. We know your life is bad, but you will always know this. You will always have a higher social status than blacks. That the white working class's self-image and self-identity and sense of social status deprived very powerfully from the fact that they were one step above blacks. To have a black family in the White House very powerfully, visibly, viscerally reverses that social status. And I think that played a large part in in what was going on. Look, when you saw posters denouncing Obamacare, and there were pictures, caricatures of Obama looking like a Kenyan witch doctor with a bone through his nose, when you had pictures of Obama looking like a monkey, clearly there was and who understood this better than anybody else? You have to give him credit, Donald Trump. What is Donald Trump's first move politically on the national stage? It is birtherism, to say that Obama was actually not born in America. He was actually a Kenyan citizen. He was, in a sense, feeding that disquiet and that discomfort. To take this guy who was basically a centrist Democrat, very, as you say, very intellectual, very thoughtful, not prone to, to kind of highly charged rhetoric, particularly he did not use any highly charged rhetoric on Black issues. Do you know, for example, the thing that in the internal polling for the Obama administration, the thing that made him drop his approval rating towards whites the most in his entire presidency in 8 years? Do you remember that incident when police officers accosted a Black Harvard professor for trying to, breaking in and entering a house in Cambridge, which turned out to be his own house, the professor being Henry Louis Gates. When Obama the next day said I think he said something like that was an asinine thing for the police to do, that incident caused Obama's ratings to drop among white Americans more than anything else he did in his presidency. You have the whole story of the political reaction to Obama in that one episode.
But Fareed, then I would ask you a very uncomfortable question, which is that do you think everything you were saying about America, that it's this great, glorious experiment, plural, many races coming together as a democracy, is actually a myth that one has constructed, that the founding fathers constructed, much like what India is having to confront, that the base emotion is, let's just now say it as it is, this is a Hindu country, and let everyone find their space within it.
Yeah, it's a very thoughtful point. The way I would put it is this. In America, there are two realities that conflict. The first is that America's experience and treatment of Blacks is, by any normal standard, tragic, cruel, and worse than many other countries. This is one of the challenges for the Democratic Party. It has tried to wrap up these issues in a way that really is rooted in the African American experience. Most other minorities in America don't feel that way. In fact, they feel like it was better, it was more welcoming, it was more absorbing. And that's one of the reasons why I think you see Hispanics breaking away and saying, well, we don't want to be tarred by the same brush. We see ourselves as aspirational. We don't see ourselves as victims. I point out, as you know, in a column, I have never checked a box that said, are you a member of a racial minority? I didn't do it when I applied to a scholarship for colleges 35 years ago. I still don't, because I don't feel like I don't think of myself as victimized. I don't want affirmative action policies that are designed correctly to address the huge historical inequity and structural racism that Blacks face. So, I think that tension is a very real tension in America. And the tragedy of America has always been this one relating to Blacks. With India, and I think I'd make this broader point. Look, of course, there is a dark reality to every country, and there are aspirations and hopes. I wouldn't describe it as a myth. To me, it's very funny to hear these people, who cynically say, well, what Nehru and Gandhi wanted was all, naive idealism. Nehru and Gandhi saw a far darker side of India's communal tensions than, frankly, any of us have ever seen. I mean, if you look at what they saw in 47, this is one of the worst civil wars in the history of the world. And even then, they persevered in the belief that it is important to have an aspiration. It is important to live by certain ideals. It is important to try to create out of that darkness light. So I view this as very much the choice of leadership. There's another reality about India. India is a more syncretic culture that has genuinely mixed together these religions and these cultures and these strands in a way that almost no country has been able to do successfully.
That brings us to this tension that I just asked you, and which you've thought deeply about, which is between constitutional democracy and electoral democracy, and what happens when electoral democracy throws up illiberalism. And speaking for myself, like as a journalist, I always feel that in the past it was easy because there was always a separation between state and people. So even when you spoke for the people against the state. You were trying to control the state and make it behave better. But now, both in America and India, there's a sense that the people and the state have come together. The people love the demagogue leaders that have been thrown up by like electoral democracy. So what is one supposed to do then? How do you push back?
Yeah, it's a very tough question. As you know, I've been thinking about it for a long time. I wrote that essay, The Rise of Illiberal Democracy, I guess it's now 25 years ago. Look, at the end of the day, one has to face an uncomfortable reality. Constitutionalism and constitutional liberalism, by which I mean the defense of individual liberties and rights, is not something that has mass appeal. It is something absolutely crucial to the functioning of a healthy liberal democracy, but it is not something the masses understand, believe in, would fight for, would die for. So when you have a demagogue, when you have somebody who can seduce people, and he or she says, trust me, I am doing this for your good, these petty barriers, laws, norms, conventions, I'm going to break them all. There's a lot of popular support for that.
Or this enterprise is seen as elite.
Absolutely. The single biggest trick of populism is to set yourself up so that you say you represent the people against this phony elite who's out of touch with the needs of the country. And that's happening in America, that's happening in Britain, it's happening in Turkey, it's happening in Poland, Hungary, and of course it's happening in India. In the United States, at least, what I would say is this. The institutions have proved to be actually quite strong. So if you look at, with Trump, we really faced a classic demagogue who tried to do all kinds of things. But what he found was the courts have stayed very independent of him. Even when he has appointed very conservative judges, the independent agencies and bureaucracies from the FBI to the CIA have stayed very strong. Look what happened just 2 days ago. His own Department of Homeland Security announced that the elections were the freest and fairest and most secure in American history. And then he promptly fired the guy who said it. The press has fought back and has tried to hold him accountable. I think that what you see in India is unfortunately, is a less developed democracy where some of those institutions are caving, where some of those institutions have caved, where it is possible to bully and intimidate the media. And particularly, you look at the treatment of NDTV, which I look at as a very Putin-like effort to send a signal to the media that this is what happens if you cross the government. And you look at the degree to which the media has acquiesced and been intimidated, it's very sad. If you look at the way courts, even the Supreme Court now, is behaving in ways that are frankly contrary to the traditions of its own traditions. In all those areas, you see much greater weakness, which is to be expected at some level. India is a much younger democracy. And one of the challenges going forward for all of us is to think about how to make it a mass project, how to make people understand that separation of powers, holding government accountable, ensuring that there is an independent judiciary, ensuring that there is a free press. This is all good for everyone. This is not some, elite parlor game that's being played for the benefit of people in Bombay, Delhi, and Calcutta or something like that.
Right. So, another very interesting statement you made, Fareed, talking about hard lessons learned from 2020 is that Biden has come definitely a sense of relief in many parts of the world, not just in America. But you made a very interesting point where you said that he's someone who might be a status quoist, might be wanting to go back to a kind of imagined stability, and that you would be very critical of that attempt. Why did you say that, and what do you think his agenda should be?
I think that there is a view in America that Trump is this terrible aberration. If only we can just go back to normal, we can do a kind of restoration. And my point is, the world has moved on and the world has changed. So the idea that you can just go back to an age when the United States was the dominant power, that all we need to do is just reassert American leadership and suddenly all elements of the world order will fall back into place. I don't think that's going to happen. The world is now very different. China is in a very different place, much more assertive, much more aggressive. But other countries too are much more confident culturally, politically, and even in foreign policy terms. The challenge for Biden and for any American president is we are now entering an age which is clearly bipolar in a structural sense. The US and China are way ahead of everybody else. but in which everyone feels empowered. So it's a sort of weird, I don't know how to quite describe it. It's a bipolar world, but in which there is a multipolar aspiration, multipolar empowerment. So nobody's going to be bossed around. So Turkey may not be nearly as powerful as the United States, but you can notice they are very assertive, they are very independent. Same is true for India, same is true for Brazil, same is true for Indonesia. So how to manage a system like that is the great challenge. The US, I think, still has a unique role in that if it sets the agenda, if it corrals people, if it tries to organize coalitions to solve common problems, it will be given a lot of attention, authority, respect, but it has to do it in a different way than the old one, which was, we are the international system, we dominate the international system, we pay for everything. That world has gone away. When the US withdrew from the World Health Organization, China said, fine, we'll fill in the gap. Whatever you were paying, we'll pay tomorrow. So we need a new way to think about this very new world. By the way, Biden is surrounded by very smart people. He has a lot of experience in foreign policy. I don't mean to suggest he won't do this. I just mean they need to be thinking not in terms of restoration. They need to be thinking much more creatively about a new world and a new American foreign policy.
So, before we move away to India, and you're talking about, just this whole shift in foreign policy, you yourself were a big advocate of America's interventions in different parts of the world. But do you think that, Fareed, even you need to maybe rethink those positions? Because so much of America's misadventures has had domestic impact as well. This mood in America also comes from its misadventures. So much of the Islamophobia across the world. And Trump, a large part of his popularity was that he just withdrew from all these messes and said, America first, America great. It may not be comfortable to rethink that, but do you think it needs to be rethought?
Look, clearly the Iraq war was a mistake and caused a certain amount of the backlash you're describing. But I would argue that there are really two ways to look at this issue, which is, has the world proceeded in a more open, liberal, democratic direction over the last 70 years? Because the United States has been an active, aggressive promoter of these ideas, these values, being willing to try to defend them, even to intervene, even when those have been misadventures? Or is it all an accident? I tend to view more towards the first, understanding that in that process of doing, you're going to make a lot of mistakes. The alternative view seems to me ahistorical. If the Soviet Union had won the Cold War, we would have a very different world than we have today. If Germany had won World War II, we would have a very different world than we have today. If the Kaiser's Germany had won World War I, we would have a very different world. So power matters. And power in the service of certain ideas and ideals does matter. It looks very messy. You make a lot of mistakes along the way. But I would argue that the notion that you can end up in the kind of world we have now, with the United States just playing a very isolationist role, I would tend to believe that that is not true. That even now, when the United States is hypocritical about a country like Saudi Arabia, for example, the fact that that hypocrisy is talked about so much. Hypocrisy is, what is Shakespeare's line? It's the homage that vice plays to virtue. The fact that you have to acknowledge, right? That exactly, that you have to, the fact that these dictators often pretend that they hold elections is itself an homage. So, the fact that the State Department will issue a report on Saudi Arabia's human rights abuses, even while Trump is shaking hands with them, all this puts a kind of pressure. The way I put it is, the United States has been more benign and less malign than any other great power in history, which may not be a very high praise, but I think it does get right the historical context.
As you're saying that, it's I chanced upon a wonderful speech by Biden, in fact, a much younger Biden, when he was arguing in the Senate about America's policy towards the apartheid regime. And
I saw,
it was brilliant. It was passionate, exactly what you were saying, that it was arguing for the ideal. And we know that, it is pressure like that when you search for the ideal, that apartheid regime at least has to break in structure, even if in practice it continues, So, but Fareed, tell me, the other thing you've been saying is that India now needs to make a choice. And it's going to be a bipolar world. It's America and China. What do you think Biden is going to board for India. You said India should decide what India wants and what is the demand. What do you think India's demand should be, and how will this relationship pair out?
So the truth is that the United States, for now 20 years, has had a very consistent policy toward India, which is to reach out to India, to try to develop much closer ties. And it is rooted in a fundamental geostrategic reality, which is the rise of China. But it is also bolstered by a natural affinity that America has for India. Look, India and America are two messy, chaotic democracies, and so they understand each other. You know, when America looks at a black box country like China, you know, run by 10 people in a system that they don't understand, it's inscrutable. India has the opportunity to have a really close alliance with America that is more people to people and government to government, the sort of alliance that the United States has with Britain or with Israel. And so that reality has been true. India has had a hard time figuring out what it wants from America and what it wants as a long-term, sustained foreign policy strategy. The last Indian prime minister to have a strategic view on this issue was Manmohan Singh. And Manmohan Singh made a very determined, I think he doesn't get enough credit for this, a very bold decision, which was to ask the Americans for the prize, which was a reversal of US sanctions on India's nuclear weapon development. And in fact, essentially to bring India into the fold and not be seen as a violator, as a pariah. And he got it. I mean, the Americans gave Manmohan Singh everything that India had been asking for 30 years. It was a bold strategy. It worked. I think now Prime Minister Modi needs to first fundamentally understand he needs to have a strategy. You know, he says that he is multi-aligned. That's just like saying you have no policy, because to be multi-aligned is to make no choice. What India should do is say to the United States, we want to have a strategic, economic, and defense relationship with you that is oriented fundamentally around technology, investment, and energy. And we find a way to become, part of the consortium that is going to be part of the world of kind of the non-China vision of trade, technology, energy, because the United States is going to want to see that China does not dominate key technologies like 5G, key energy like solar, wind, and potentially hydrogen and fuel cells. And so in that context, India can play an incredibly important role. India has to be aggressive about it and has to recognize that these are great opportunities, but you have to hustle. I mean, the Israelis don't sit quietly. Even the British don't sit quietly. They're constantly trying to make these asks, to make these demands, to fashion them in a way that will be approved. At the end of the day, the US is still the largest economy in the world, by far. It's still the largest military in the world, by far. India gets more out of this than the US does. So it's incumbent on India to make the ask.
So what do you think is the holdback in the psyche?
I think part of it is that there has always been in India some of this kind of post-colonial, non-aligned suspicion of the West. And that derives from the Nehruvian era. But I think a part of it is that, look, within the Modi and the BJP, as you well know, there are two very different strands. On the one hand, they're sort of they're pro-American because for many years the Congress was anti-American. And that dates back to the kind of Indira Gandhi period. But the roots of the BJP are very anti-foreign. They're very much part of a kind of Swadeshi mentality. They're very suspicious of external influences, cultural, economic. So the BJP is very comfortable with the kind of India firstism, if you will, a version of Trump's America firstism. I think that plays a larger role than people realize. Modi likes to have good photo ops with foreign leaders. He manages those relationships personally very well, very skillfully, because he's a very skillful politician. But you will notice that in almost none of them could you say that there has then been a sustained foreign policy that developed out of it, a strategic long-term relationship. He has a good meeting with the Japanese prime minister. He has a good meeting with the American president. But it doesn't amount to anything because fundamentally, I think they're very insular. They're very parochial. Even in this pandemic, the first thing that Modi says is, hunker down. We're too dependent on the rest of the world. We need to buy locally, which is all, frankly, nonsense because India would not be able to get the kind of medical supplies, equipment, know-how if it were to be, isolated by itself. India is still only what, 3-4% of the world economy at best. It has to, if it wants to grow, if it wants to help hundreds of millions of Indians get out of poverty, it's going to have to interact with the other 97% of the world economy.
Fareed, again, there's that, like, this kind of complex strands that we've been trying to explore in the conversation, is that typically globalization hasn't always helped the country. I mean, there might be a slice of society that does better, but that's exactly why there was a blowback in America. People do have to walk that line. And do you think Modi's at all been good with that? Or what is your assessment of Modi?
I don't think he's been good on that issue. And the way I would describe the problem with globalization in trade and technology, and they're all wrapped up, it's very difficult to distinguish, is that there's no question it benefits the country as a whole. GDP, after all, is the aggregate number of how the economy is doing. And 100 million Indians have moved out of extreme poverty in the last 20 years. The problem is that the benefits are spread thinly across the entire population. The costs are felt narrowly in pockets, right? There will be one town where the factory will go out of business. And so you have this concentrated, very visible feeling of loss. But you don't notice that everybody has ended up with, food prices being 20% lower than they were. The problem is a political one. It's almost an optical one, which is that the costs are always concentrated and narrow. The benefits are widely spread, but somewhat thin. I think Modi has not fundamentally moved India toward a higher growth model. I think that Modi is not really the kind of Reagan, Thatcher idea that many people had, that he's going to unleash the entrepreneurial spirits of the Indian economy. Modi basically is somebody who believes that he is a good, competent manager. He can run things well, and that he can run India's quasi-socialist economy better than the Congress did. I think he's probably right about that. There's no recognition that the system is fundamentally flawed, that it needs much deeper reforms. I'll give you one example. The public sector banks in India are a national travesty, because here you have thousands and thousands of crores of rupees being frittered away, basically to buy political patronage. And instead of reforming them and creating a proper system where you can provide much better benefits and more widely available benefits to everybody, every government, and Modi is no different, insists on maintaining these vehicles. To me, that's one of the best indications, because of course what that means is that you are privileging power and patronage over actually doing something to help the lives of people. That, maybe one of the flaws of Modi. He clearly is very reluctant to give up anything that gives him control. My view has always been, you want a free market, but you want it regulated properly. Public sector banks have 75% of the savings of the Indian people. 75% of the savings. And yet, one private bank, HDFC, has a market capitalization larger than all the public sector banks put together. That tells you how inefficient the system is. And when I say inefficient, remember, we are talking about taxpayers' money that is being wasted. So, it sounds like an inefficiency is a minor issue. It's not. You are taking people's hard-earned money and you are squandering it. And you're squandering it for political reasons. No system is perfect. But my point was really more about Modi and control.
So it was interesting, Fareed. You sound much more optimistic about America than I had thought you'd sound, and your entire analysis.
Well, Biden won.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But, even about these underlayers, like you said, actually good leadership can turn the ship very easily, and that mood can subside. So now when you look at India, what do you feel? Are you as optimistic? What's your assessment of us?
I'm quite optimistic about India economically. I think even Modi has turned a corner. With the pandemic might have forced him to, but he's doing some more reforms than he's had to do in the past. If you take cumulatively the reforms that have been done by the Congress government and by Modi over the last 20 years, they're quite substantial. I mean, India can never do kind of big bang. I think India has the potential to grow. It needs, in India, a lot of it is not the announcement of a new policy, it's the implementation. And that's where, I'm hopeful actually that Modi will be able to make a difference. On the communal side, look, it's very sad, honestly, that you have a party that is manipulating these feelings, that is exacerbating divisions. Of course, these divisions exist. Let's be honest. What we're talking about mostly is the Hindu-Muslim issue. I would hope that, as Modi gets toward the part of his reign where he will be thinking about his legacy, one would hope he would recognize that the challenge is not to subdue and coerce, but to allow a system that provides for dignity and tolerance for everyone. I still come back to this fact that India is unique. To me, the ghazals and the qawwalis I heard as a child in India are the perfect illustration of why India is different. So with the ghazal, you have the Hindu rag structure, on top of which you layer Urdu poetry, sometimes Persian poetry, right? And so it's a perfect example of how it's not the tolerance of two religions, but the intermingling of the two religions that has made India unique. India is really could be a model for the world, even more than a place like the United States, where everyone is tolerated, everyone is, there's separate spaces and they are respected. But in India, there really has been a mingling. I would love to see an Indian leader who would notice that's what's distinctive about India. I mean, there's so many monocultural places in the world. There's so many places with a dominant culture, which then represses the other. India's unique contribution to humanity in some ways has been this extraordinary diversity. I still hold out hope. Look, I'm an optimist by nature. If you look at the long view, these things don't work. End of the day, all these groups have been in India. They're not going anywhere. You're going to have to find a way to live and let live. I don't want to minimize. India is going through a bad phase with regard to these issues, because you have a group of people in power who believe that the answer is suppression, repression, oppression, and forcing the minority to kind of come to terms with its reduced minority status, which is not a recipe for an open, pluralistic, democratic society. It reminds me a little bit of some of the issues surrounding Israel and the Palestinians, which is, it's not an issue that, the Muslims in India are not going to revolt. Where will they go? But it's a question of what kind of society do you want to live in?
But let me ask you a counter question on that, Fareed, which is that, do you think there was also some correction that needed to be done? There was a certain blindsidedness, a certain pushing under the carpet, that do you really think that liberals also need to articulate with much more courage, with much more conviction and much less noblesse oblige, like, if there are things that Muslims do wrong, 70 years later, you should be able to say it, Or if there's, for instance, like, let's take the triple talaq, and I questioned Owaisi Saab a lot about that. I said, even Hindu cultural practices have been legislated on. No society voluntarily changes itself. In fact, Uniform Civil Code is going to come up. Do you think that liberals, secularists, whatever this broad spectrum of people who believe in plurality need to articulate ourselves differently? Even on questions of history, did we need to have a more courageous look at what was wrong about the Muslim rule and not make it something that impacts modern India, but admit to what there was in the past?
Yeah, I think broadly speaking, you're right. I think that with regard to some of the history and with regard to the Uniform Civil Code, I always thought it was a bad idea to coddle Muslims. And by the way, there is a lot of this in the law for other communities as well. I think that the whole idea of having a uniform civil code and then having, personal law separate is a complicated issue and should have been something that was phased out over time. But it never became electorally advantageous for the Congress to try to do that. And then, they pandered in their own way. But that doesn't, to my mind, excuse this sort of rewriting of history and changing the textbooks. Look, genuine multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy is hard. It's hard in India, it's hard in America, but I would rather err on the side of pluralism and respect rather than erring on the side of repression and oppression.
So let me ask you the difficult question, which is on Kashmir and which will become very important even in the new dispensation in America. That, again, there's no argument at all on human rights violations, on any of that. But the tricky question about whether, because it's a Muslim majority area, that it conceives of itself as separate or a separate nation, whether aligned with Pakistan, the original contention. 70 years later, when you're fighting, you're opposed to the idea of a Hindu Rashtra or a religious majoritarianism, on mainland India. It's difficult to make a case that, because it's Muslim majority, it should have a right to a separate nation, or a separate identity. So on the issue of just 370, do you think its time was done? The manner, oppression, human rights, I'm not even getting into that.
Yeah, I think you're asking a very difficult question, because it's very difficult to isolate that one element. But my own personal view is, yes, I do not think that there should be a special status, or at least there shouldn't be a kind of unique status. I don't mind there being some special arrangements that, may relate to the particularly unusual historical origins of Kashmir entering the Union. But I don't think there should be a fundamentally separate and privileged status because it's Muslim majority. But the truth is that in Kashmir, you've had three things wrapped up together. One is the special status. One is Pakistan's continued efforts to foment violence and separatism by using terrorism. And the third is the absolute suspension of human rights and the rule of law in Kashmir, right? And so the problem is all three are happening simultaneously. And so it's not as though by dealing with 370, you solve the other problems, right? So I would like to see something which says, okay, if you're not giving them special privileges, then maybe there should also be an end to the special repression that is taking place in Kashmir. The suspension of habeas corpus. Essentially, Kashmir has been under martial law for 40 years now. So what I would be comfortable with was a comprehensive approach to Kashmir, which said, we're going to change 370, but we are also going to change this brutal martial law that they face. And we're going to try to negotiate with the Pakistanis to have an end to the tension that comes from there. To just do one, again, feels like it's part of a political cultural agenda.
The really disturbing aspect is the removal of 35A, and because other states have that special status where, others can't come and buy land, but by opening up Kashmir to, other people coming in and buying land, it does look like an attempt to change the demography of the place. So just to end on now, Fareed, it's been so strange that right through the pandemic, and your book actually, the book you've just written, mentions some of this, that while there's been such inequity, the markets and the top layers of society have actually benefited hugely. So how is one to read this whole separation of consequences that's going on in the world, that no matter what happens, and that's why I don't think that this pandemic is actually going to create any change, because decision makers, the wealthy, have not felt its pain very much at all. Do you agree with that? And why have the markets been surging regardless of the economies everywhere plummeting?
Look, the most worrying thing about this pandemic has been the rise in inequality. There's no question that it is deep, it is structural, and the pandemic has massively exacerbated it. The reason it's happened is really two things. One, we have already been moving in a direction where capitalism is using fewer and fewer people to generate more and more economic output. So, you're able to get an enormous amount done with a very small number of people. Now, the next stage is the digital revolution, which even does that in an exacerbated fashion. So we are facing a very difficult challenge. I hope that you're wrong in that I hope that this is a wake-up call to people all over the world, that markets are going to be very efficient, they're going to produce a lot of wealth, but it then becomes the role of government to ask itself, what does it do to provide opportunities for people who are left behind? That becomes the political challenge. The economics are clearly pointing in the direction you described, greater and greater inequality along almost every dimension. The challenge is for politics to then come in to heal some of those wounds.
Thank you very, very much, Fareed.
My pleasure. Take care.